Hello and welcome. My name is Joshua Mott. I am the CEO of Harvard Business Publishing, and I am thrilled to welcome all of you to what is the second in a series that we've been doing, a think tank series that we've been doing on leadership transformation. And today in particular, we're focused on that sort of transformation, but in light of dealing with the implications of climate change. I'm also excited to just be telling you all that we continue to expand our own presence in the region. So I'm joined here today with Carolyn Wright, who's heads up sales in the region, along with Ben Jones, Sinead Lindley, and Rajiv Manloy. And we are all thrilled to be here. A big part of our mission within the corporate learning part of our business is to really help organizations to build the skills that they need for their leaders in order to take on the challenges that seem to be coming up fast and furiously for all organizations around the world in a time of volatility. It seems that our mission has never been more important. And I also want to, I'm also excited today that we'll be discussing the ministry's mission of spearheading UAE's drive to mitigate and adapt to the implications of climate change, along with protecting the country's ecosystem and enhancing food security. So I'm thrilled that we'll be able to have that conversation. And along with a welcome to Paul Polman, who I'm thrilled to say is a contributor to HBR, along with having been the CEO of Unilever. But I think we are really privileged that Paul chose to publish with us his book, Net Positive, which has had a huge impact on so many leaders around the world and is a really important book. And I think a real turning point in really what is the discussion around how companies can act and behave in a way that is pushing, essentially for the betterment of society, right? Netting out on the side of positive, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But the notion of doing that and being able to still perform financially is put forward in such a compelling way and such a cogent way within the book and articles that Paul has written for us as well. And so I'm really excited that we'll have a chance to hear more from him as well in this conversation. But I'm also very excited to hear from all of you. And so, there'll be an opportunity, I'm sure, for people to chime in with their own questions as well. And I look forward to participating in the conversation myself. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Salu Luta here, who is the president of Harvard Business School's GCC Alumni Club. And I'm so thankful that we are co-hosting the event with the club as well. So I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Paul. First of all, Your Excellency, really thank you for being with us in this great initiative, which is Think Tank. It is something about how can we really contribute as a club in the transformation happening in the region. We believe that we have a role as a club with the number of alumni we have. We have more than 1,200 alumni already in the club. With such brain power, what can we contribute as a club to really help government in the region to go through these transformations? I do believe that we have a great opportunity today that we can make a good positive impact when we talk about sustainability environment for two reasons. I think because we are blessed by having the most dynamic government in the region, which is UAE. Thank you, Your Excellency. Plus having the Harvard brain power behind us. Leveraging both elements, I'm sure that we can really push this agenda forward, not only in Dubai or in the UAE, in the region itself, because we are across all the GCC countries. We're looking really to be part of these transformations, and we are really here to offer our help. How can we really add value? And this reflected also in our initiatives. Most of our program really talked about this transformation. If we talk about Think Tank, it is really about this transformation. We have another initiative called Drive, which is really how can we help government in the region use the knowledge, the experience, the know-how which our alumni have, and then we have the one of the most important initiative, which is a crossroad, which we do it yearly. I'm sure that sustainability will be one of the agenda in each of these initiatives. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm sorry, I apologize, I was on mute. I'm Amy Bernstein, I'm the editor of Harvard Business Review, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. I'm so happy to be here with you. Let me start by introducing our guests of honor. Her Excellency Mariam Bint Mohammed Saeed Hareb Almheiri is the Minister of Climate Change and Environment of the UAE. In this capacity, she leads the ministry's drive to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, protect the country's ecosystems, and enhance its food and water security through developing and implementing effective measures, policies, and initiatives. Prior to this role, Her Excellency was Minister of State for Food and Water Security. Her responsibilities in that role included monitoring national food stocks and water supply, channeling investments in food and water technology innovation, and building international partnerships in this area. Previously, Her Excellency was Minister of State for Food Security, where she oversaw the development of necessary infrastructure to achieve the country's food security objectives in line with the UAE Centennial 2071. Welcome, Your Excellency. I also want to welcome Paul Polman, who works to accelerate action by business to tackle climate change and inequality. A leading proponent that business should be a force for good, Paul's been described by the Financial Times as a standout CEO of the past decade. As CEO of Unilever from 2009 to 2019, he demonstrated that a long-term multi-stakeholder model goes hand in hand with excellent financial performance. Paul was a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel that developed the Sustainable Development Goals, and which he continues to champion, working with global organizations and across industry to advance the 2030 development agenda. His new book, Net Positive, is a call to arms to courageous business leaders setting out how to build net positive companies which profit by fixing the world's problems rather than by creating them. He chairs Imagine, a social venture dedicated to systems change, and Saeed Business School, where he is the vice chair of the UN Global Compact as well as the B Team leader. Paul is the honorary chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, which he's led for 2 years. Thank you both for being here. We are going to discuss how business and governments can work together to leverage both the opportunities for competitive advantage and the leadership capabilities required to drive sustainability. So with this, I will hand it over to, I believe, to Paul. Is that correct?
It's fine with me. If Her Excellency is okay with that, I'll kick it off with some remarks before hers. I understood that was...
Absolutely.
Is that okay? Is that okay? Good to see you again, Your Excellency, and Mariam bin Mohammed Saeed. We met in the COP26 and had a great discussion. Turns out that you studied not far away from my hometown. So congratulations also with the chairmanship of the COP28, which is going to be a very important COP, and glad to see the region leading there. And someone with your background, including in food and agriculture, as we start to understand increasingly the links between climate change and biodiversity and our food chain, it's even more important than ever. Also, thanks to Amy and to Josh and to Saleh for the kind introduction. The first thing is I was in the UAE not long ago, and again benefited from your great hospitality and congratulate you on the 50th Jubilee year as well. You've always been a great influence in the region, and I think you're continuing to do this with this discussion on climate change as well. You've always taken bold commitments. That was very clear to me, and certainly here where you look at decarbonization again, I think in a very difficult environment, very challenging trade-offs, you're actually taking the lead as well again. So I'd like to acknowledge Harvard as well for giving us the opportunity to actually be here and talk really the ambitious targets that are needed to help the world. UAE has always said its view on the future. I believe you already have a legacy of sustainability. Even your founding father, Sheikh Saeed bin Nahyan, was a key proponent of sustainable growth. And it's good to see you continuing on that journey. Your vision is clear, there's no doubt about that, to build an economy based on clean energy, based on knowledge, based on partnership, all the things we're undoubtedly going to talk. You were the first one to rally people around signing for the Paris Agreement in the region. You told me you are the first one with a net zero commitment for 2050 with all its challenges. You've launched your hydrogen initiative. You obviously, your mangrove projects, you talked about restoring nature, but also the leading role you've already played in the COP26, with the Fund on Agricultural Innovation, together with the United States, the Transition Accelerator to finance renewable energy, especially in the emerging markets. So your role goes well beyond your region alone, and I just want to thank you for that. We're all familiar with the challenges. I don't need to talk about that, but frankly, our economic system is broken. We've discovered that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and anything you can't do forever is by definition unsustainable. Last year, World Overshoot Day, which is the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish, was July 29th. In other words, after that date, we're actually stealing from future generations. We're living well beyond our planetary boundaries, and the effects are increasingly visible. COVID, just like Zika, SARS, Ebola, Asian flu, is a zoonotic disease and directly the result of our destruction of biodiversity. And we're good at it. In the short period that we've been on Earth, even the shorter period of the Industrial Revolution, we've been able to cut about 50% of the world's forest, as an example. We've eliminated in the last 5 decades 68% of our species, mammals, birds, reptiles. It's just not a trajectory that is sustainable anymore. We have to change course. But COVID has also shown the complexity of the system. First and foremost, it has made people realize that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, but it has also shown the difficult interrelationships between biodiversity, human health, climate change, the racial dimensions that have come up, and obviously the economy itself. Now, it would all be easy if multilateralism would work and if global governments would function. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It is fair to say that many of our multilateral institutions are not quite functioning anymore the way we've designed them. Yet the issues of cybersecurity, financial markets, the pandemic itself, climate change, are increasingly of global nature. So with governments increasingly more paralyzed, if I may say, regretfully, to move these things forward, my argument in the book Net Positive is very simple, that business needs to step up to help fill that void. Business is 65% of the global economy, 80% of the financial flow, 90% of the job creation. It is simply impossible to reach the Sustainable Development Goals if business doesn't take up assume a higher level of responsibility. Now, the IPCC report has made it clear that climate change is probably our biggest urgency that we need to deal with, and certainly the biggest challenge. It's coming at us at the speed of the technological revolution, and it requires a transformation of society at the scale of the Industrial Revolution. And many people struggle with that. Unfortunately, we like it or not, we don't have until 2050. We don't even have until 2040. We need to show significant progress, as the science shows us, between now and 2030. With His Excellency and many others at the COP26, I think we have had a reasonable outcome. At least politically, I would say we actually over-delivered. Despite COVID being a major distraction, we have now 90% of global emissions on net zero commitments by governments. $130 trillion of money under management with the Glasgow Financial Alliance of Net Zero. Many companies stepping up, making commitments to be net zero based on science-based targets. And it's not surprising. On the one hand, the signals from the marketplace are increasing. The citizens of this world are asking for it. The employees in your companies are threatening with buyouts or walkouts or the great resignation that we see. But increasingly, the financial market is interested in it. And dare I say at this conference that I believe the financial market is not so much able to move on moral grounds, but they certainly smell an opportunity if the financial drivers are good. And the financial market is increasingly seeing that attacking climate change, for example, is not just a risk mitigation opportunity, but increasingly an opportunity actually to build a profitable business moving forward. We've seen ESG funds, which are now approaching $50 trillion globally, outperforming the non-ESG funds by a significant margin over 2021. We've seen the financial market itself making commitments, as I said, to decarbonize their portfolios. We're seeing companies accelerating their moves into this direction, and you simply don't want to miss the boat. Most CEOs know what needs to be done. They don't want more climate change or unemployment or food security issues, but they struggle with the how. These are very complex transitions. And what we are doing in this book is actually that is meant to create a movement, is to really establish a standard of what good looks like. With World Overshoot Day, July 29th, corporate social responsibility or being less bad, i.e. making a commitment to reducing a little bit of plastic or reducing a little bit of carbon emission is simply not good enough anymore. So people say, I understand that. Less bad is still bad. So I need to be sustainable, net zero. But even the net zero commitments we need to doubt as being the right standard to go for, when we really need to start thinking restorative, regenerative, reparative. And this is what we call net positive. A simple question is being asked: how can companies profit from solving the world's problems, not creating the world's problems? And frankly asking, is the world better off because your company is in it or not? The hallmarks of a net positive company are very simple. First and foremost, take responsibility of your total impact in this society. Your handprint, not just your footprint. Many companies outsource their value chain and also think they can outsource their responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. Not only do we need to make commitments on climate change, for example, on scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3, and we would argue beyond. The second characteristic is that we need to optimize our returns for all of our stakeholders. If we want to be around long term, it also means we have to take care of our people, our communities, the planet, future generations, the partners in our value chains. These companies understand that profits are a result of what you do and not a myopic objective. And last but not least, more importantly, net positive companies understand that optimizing within a current system that frankly isn't designed anymore to deliver is not the right answer. We need to actively take co-responsibility, working with governments and civil society to actually drive these broader systems changes that are needed to create this more equitable and sustainable world. It's not easy to do. Our book is very practical because it's written by a practitioner, not a consultant or an academic. I've worked in the CEO job of Unilever for 10 years. We've actually set the example of the direction we need to take. We've done that whilst at the same time having a 300% shareholder return and outperforming our competition. We just now need to learn from this very practical book with key examples on how to do this. And my final comment is, it actually is, most importantly, is a leadership transformation. Working on our own consciousness and self-awareness is probably the bigger challenge for all of us than the company transformations or the broader systems transformations. Rumi, who was a poet in the 13th century in Iran, said it very well when he said, yesterday I was smart, I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, I'm changing myself. And that is where it really starts in this journey. Over to you.
Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, for those insights, and thank you so much, Saleh, for having me here, and all of you for inviting me and for having me here in this Harvard think tank discussion. when Saleh called me and asked me whether I should come. I mean, I'm first of all honored because having any discussions on, I mean, Harvard is a known business school, and being able to speak to yourselves and having to exchange also views, because I also would like to hear from the others what they're facing. But I think Paul has mentioned so many really important aspects, and so what I'd like to do is just give our listeners a little bit of insight as to where we are as a government, and how our journey was, also why actually what's happening now is a very natural step for the UAE to take. And Paul, you probably heard this already because we had these discussions. So about 15 years ago, our leadership really, they saw the writing on the wall. As you all know, we are oil and gas country, but our leadership already understood that it's time to diversify our economy, and it's time to be less dependent on the oil and gas and really look into what's coming up in future. So signing and ratifying the Paris Agreement, being the first in the country, in the region to do so, was a bold step. As Paul said, it actually follows the journey that His Highness Sheikh Zayed, our founder and father of the UAE, has put in. And he loved the environment. He was an advocate of the environment, and it was very much about partnerships as well, and always thinking a few years ahead. And so the leadership, taking that same journey, understood that we need to do this. And for many, this was very strange. Like, why would you want to go into renewables and clean energy? But we invested about 17 billion US dollars in the last 15 years, I would say, in 70 different countries. We have a lot of projects on renewables, also invested a lot of money in the country as well. We set up Masdar City, which is basically our renewable energy catalyst. We also host IRENA here as well. And then it was for us a natural step going towards COP26, where we said we want to work towards a net zero initiative. And so that was also announced, also being the first country in the region to do so. At COP26, we were about 200 delegates who were at COP26. So the UAE took a strong team, also with private sector as well, because as you said, Paul, the private sector, they play a huge role, and they do so here as well in the UAE. We went to COP26. This was my first, let's say, official mission as Minister of Climate Change and Environment. Before that, I was more focused on the food systems. But of course, food systems and climate change actually are very, very much interlinked. So going to COP26, the UAE made a lot of, or joined a lot of pledges. We also looked at nature-based solutions, such as the mangrove planting. We actually increased our pledge. We had, in our NDCs, we had said we're going to plant 30 million mangrove trees by 2030. We've upped that to 100 million. So we're taking this very seriously, and of course we were very honored that we are now going to be chairing the COP28, which is also a huge milestone for the UAE. And what's really good about this is that both COP27 and COP28 are in the region, which really helps in pushing the climate change agenda. For us, we see also the climate change agenda really as an opportunity of a new economic growth, which attracts new skills, new jobs. So the UAE really sees this as a new trajectory path, and this is what we want to build on as well. So this is on the energy side. On the food system side, because of course greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't just come from the energy sector. On the food system side, Aim for C was launched also at COP26, as Paul mentioned. This was done with the United States of America, and so far we have over 30 countries and 70 non-governmental entities also joined. We're going to have the first ministerial meeting for that in the next month, and with that really start the implementation of this. I think what's really important here is we all need to understand that every country is at a different level, and this transition is it's very important that, like, for example, the UAE is also helping other countries in this transition. We are blessed with the oil and gas that we have, but we also take our role as global responsible citizens to ensure that we are decarbonizing our oil and gas sector as much as possible, ramping up our renewables and our transition in food systems, our transition in the transportation and the industry, ramping that up while decarbonizing those traditional systems that we have, and eventually also becoming independent of them. So it's important that people understand that this transition is the complex part is that we're all at different levels and we all have different resources for this. And so the enabling point, and Paul, you mentioned this as well, looking at the financing, the access to finance, looking at helping the developing countries as well, because many of them are really at a really bad level now, and COVID-19 has pushed us a few steps back, and the SDGs, especially for the zero hunger, is not looking good at all. So we really need to accelerate in the next 9 years, or nearly 8 years now, to 2030. There's really not much time left, and so it's really important that we think of the multilateralism, that we kind of play out a hand-in-hand initiative with the developing countries, that we ensure that the funds that have been announced are actually accessible for the people that are really in need of this. And so also we're very honored that we are, for the Indonesia G20, that we are a guest country in it. So we'll be also in our role as the UAE, will be highlighting as well some of the initiatives that the UAE is doing in bridging the gaps and also assisting developing countries. Paul mentioned what has happened through the COVID pandemic. That, I mean, we're still kind of trying to get used to a new normal now in our lives. But if you look at the opportunities of what has happened through COVID, I mean, we've never developed a vaccination so fast before. How we are now having this meeting, this hybrid version, are things that have been accelerated. How we're now using e-commerce has catapulted. So I think there are so many opportunities that we can see when we come to the situation where we're really in need to do something, we can do it. So it's really important to take up these positive aspects. And from my side also, I mean, this is why I also agreed to come and sit here and listen to you, because I really feel like the private sector role in this journey is really important. We need to listen and we need to enable the private sector to be able to, because everyone feels that responsibility now. It's now normal to have a chief sustainability officer in any company. And this was before not really the case. You had the CEO, the CFO, but chief sustainability officer was not as common. But this is now best practice. And actually, we as individuals start looking at things like, I mean, if you just look at food, where food comes from, we're looking at where has this food come from? What are the carbon emissions associated with that food? And the same goes now, and when you're looking for a job, or I think people are much more open to looking at what is this company doing as a CSR program or sustainability. How are they looking at things like consume water and electricity? Are they looking at making sure that the building they're in has certain certifications? So this is becoming common practice now. And so, but again, we're at the situation where we need to accelerate this more. And just like Paul said, what can we, like, I have to listen as well to the private sector and understand what it is that we can do more to help them accelerate the efforts that are needed. So back to you, Amy.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for those simultaneously sobering but also optimistic messages. Let me start with something you both mentioned. You both brought up multilateralism, and Paul, you said that our multilateral institutions are kind of broken, that they're not up to this task. I wonder if you could help us understand how we can fix them. Do they need to be redesigned, reconceived? How do we reinvigorate multilateralism? Paul?
Yeah, that's a very important thing. And obviously elements like trust will play a big role in that. But you see, we should recognize that most of these institutions were created at the time of Bretton Woods in 1944, when actually 44 countries, basically in Europe and the US, went together, when 95% or 90% of the global economy was located in this part of the world. And whilst companies in the preceding 80 years, let's say, have probably updated their strategies 5 or 10 times to stay alive, these institutions have basically not adapted to the realities of today. And that is really where the challenge is. Increasingly global issues that need to be addressed, but institutions that don't reflect anymore that reality. And then the second thing, as we've seen, for example, with the WTO, or some of the issues with the World Bank and others, that countries itself, are simply not wanting to play together in leveraging these institutions. A good example is the vaccine distribution, or the way the WHO has been squeezed. 90% of the vaccinations happening in these parts of the world, where most of the people have access to vaccinations and boosters, the developing world less than 10%. So this global solidarity is probably one of the most important things, where also the private sector can help, and civil society. Many of the things that we have to deal with know no borders, and many of the businesses want to have these issues solved on a global basis. They have the possibility, in most cases, to take a little bit of a longer term horizon than governments, which have increasingly become shorter term as well with these pressures. So the main way to solve that is actually to take co-responsibility, not finger pointing, or not putting the blame there and then accepting results that are frankly unacceptable for mankind, but really stepping in. How many companies work actively with Ngozi at the WTO? How many work actively with Tetros as the WHO? We've seen some examples of that, where, as Mariam says, the pharma went together, and some of the businesses started to pressure countries to keep borders open and the flow of PPE material. But we need to forge more of these partnerships. And that obviously starts with a level of trust. The second one is the multilateral finance institutions. We have, obviously, the flow of money is going to decide how we are going to transform our economies. It's not going to be a cheap thing. It needs about 2% of global GDP that we need to spend year after year to decarbonize, change our infrastructure, pivot to this new, greener, more inclusive economy. So how can you ensure that the multilateral institutions have a different remit? Instead of financing projects, that they are really the catalyzing force, that they take risk and encourage blended financing, and help the financial stream of money towards that future. And that can only happen if we start measuring what counts. The implementation of the Sustainable Standard Board, putting a price on carbon, increasingly having people focus not only on return on financial capital, but also social and environmental capital are some of the areas we need to push for that. I'll leave it here for the moment.
Amy, if I can jump in as well and say something about the multilateralism aspect. What Paul said is so true, and I mean, we're really blessed here with the leadership that we have, because we launched, or His Highness launched for the UAE, the principles of the next 50, because last year we, as Paul had mentioned, we celebrated our 50th birthday. And with that, also the leadership announced what the principles of the next 50 years are. And in that was very much about our foreign policy and forging relationships with other countries. And I mean, the Abraham Accords was a huge step in that direction. Again, a very bold step from our side, but that brought now so many opportunities, so many economic opportunities, so much more communication. The Prosperity project, which I signed with the Jordan and Israel, was another example of this, where the UAE is bridging the gaps or bridging between countries, bringing science, know-how, technology. So there was a desalination plant that's going to be built in Israel, and water from there is going to go to Jordan, and Jordan's going to have a solar plant where the energy is going to be given to Israel, and the UAE is basically helping setting this up with the knowledge and technology. I think these are all great examples of how the UAE is really taking leadership in building bridges and multilateralism. Aim for Seed is another project exactly in the same lines. Many people think, why would the UAE want to partner with the United States for something on agriculture? And when we first had the conversation with the US, it really came down to technology and innovation. Secretary Vilsack from the US side, I mean, said to me then as well, he's like, this was a real eye-opener for him, because he always saw the UAE as a small country, and why would they be interested in agriculture? But now, just over the last few years, while we're now transitioning to more sustainable food systems and looking to growing more here in the UAE and harnessing technology, it then clicked and understood that actually the whole thing of this is multilateralism, sharing knowledge, harnessing technology. And I mean, if it works here in the UAE, it will work everywhere else. I mean, we have one of the harshest environments here. We're a water scarce country. We have hardly any arable land. Yet we're now, with technology, growing salmon, blueberries, quinoa, lots of vegetables, and really high quality. And for the first time, the UAE can actually enjoy as well the flavors of things that have been produced locally and hasn't been on the route of being imported. I mean, now blueberries really have a taste, for example. So these are just some examples of what multilateralism can do and what opportunities lie there. And I think it's really important to highlight this, that there is a big need in doing this and showcasing these examples.
So, Your Excellency, clearly there's a great deal of promise in multilateralism. Paul mentioned that multilateralism, in order to reinvigorate it, it has to be built on a foundation of trust. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you build that foundation of trust?
Communicate. It comes down to just, you must, when you really care about something and you really want it to happen, it's how much effort you put in to make sure that on the other side, that they're feeling that this is something you really want to get going. You need to convince, you need to showcase examples, you need to show them also what it needs to be, a win-win at the end of the day. So it needs to be, okay, you'll be doing this, but you'll be gaining this as well. So it's really important. I mean, in anything that we do and in anything we want to get approved by our bosses, it always needs to be something where they see a gain or a value gain for the country. And at the same time, they understand if they would put efforts in this, they would benefit from it as well. So, and it takes a lot of effort in the beginning to make that communication. And sometimes, we're dealing as well with different cultures, different time zones, but you just have to put that effort there and say, it's okay if I wake up earlier in the morning or stay up later, just to give my potential partners as well the feeling that we really care about this and we want to get this going. So it's a very basic thing, actually.
No, I agree with that. Trust comes from really shared objectives, transparency, accountability. And transparency is a big part of that. When we launched the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, we put 50 targets out there to the public and said, together we need to do this, but we hold ourselves accountable to that. And that really is the basis for trust, which obviously is the main ingredient of prosperity. So increasingly, we're starting to see that happen The climate change negotiations are a good example of that, where the countries need to come in with clear NDCs, nationally determined commitments around a shared objective to stay below the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius in global warming. Already too much, but that's what we still can achieve right now. And then holding ourselves accountable. The fact that the politicians came out of COP26 by saying we're going to put ourselves into higher ambitions already next year because we can't wait for 5 years, and then obviously pulling that through when the UAE is hosting it, is a very important part. So you have this shared objectives, transparency, and accountability.
And I would add credibility as well to that.
Absolutely.
That's also really important. Credibility.
Credibility.
Yes.
Walking the walk, talking the talk.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's really important. I mean, even for us, again, hosting as well COP28, we want to make sure this is an inclusive, consultative, accessible COP for all. We want to make sure youth are engaged, and we also want to show them that it's been a long journey for us. This is not just something we've picked up in the last year and said we want to be part of this. We've been doing this for many years, and we have 3 of the largest solar parks in the UAE that are producing the lowest cost solar energy. So we need to show them this. They can come and see it. We've got also the first green hydrogen facility as well. So this is all to show also the international community that the UAE is taking big steps and is investing in this, because we know this is the right thing to do, and it is something we have to do.
So Paul, you've been a real exemplar of courageous leadership, but not every private sector leader has demonstrated your kind of courage. And I wonder what your message to them is. How do you encourage them to get involved? Is it really through the mechanism of the financial markets? Is there more than that?
Well, there is the moral argument, and as people say, the arch of morality will ultimately bend towards morality, but the reality is we can't really wait that long for that. We're running out of time. We've simply let these issues accumulate. So what you then need to do is really make the economic forces work to your advantage. And what we can show with increasing certainty and confidence is that actually the best way longer term to maximize shareholder return, if you believe in this longer term aspect, is to take care of your people. If you ensure that you have a representative workforce, that you invest in sustainable sourcing. So the ESG criteria are actually increasingly the drivers for successful financial returns. And I think that ultimately is going to tip the balance at scale. And we're starting to see that. The minister was talking about the solar plants and the cost of energy. You know, the International Energy Agency was saying in 2014, not that long ago, that it would take us till 2050 to have clean energy, wind and solar, at the same cost as fossil. That was at that time 5 cents per kilowatt hour. We are now in the UAE, we're seeing in these 3 enormous plants that are being built. You have the climate, you have the space, 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. We've achieved it in 2020 when we thought 2050. The same International Energy Agency was saying electric vehicles will replace combustion engines by 2050. That's likely to happen already in 2024, 2025. In fact, last year here in the UK, we sold more electric vehicles than the previous 5 years combined. So we are starting to see these tipping points happening because it just makes economic sense. There are 2 things with the problem with human beings is that we think linear, we can't think exponential. We always underestimate how fast technology goes, and we actually overestimate how much time we have to solve the problems. So if we could get over those little bottlenecks, if you want to, but technology has been a key driver of making many more things possible. And then you have the force of the market, may I say. The Generation C and millennials simply don't want to work for companies anymore that don't take a responsible position towards inclusion or towards climate change. And the financial market has caught on now as well. We see increasingly the financial market asking companies to drive these changes more aggressively than they otherwise would. So what my final comment very briefly is, during COVID, we've seen again once more that leaders that are courageous, which actually comes from the French word cœur, which is heart. They are leaders with a higher level of empathy, with compassion, listening skills, as Her Excellency says, have a deep purpose, embrace partnership, think multilateral and multi-generational. These are the leaders that have done better. And why? Because they just instill a higher level of trust in a more uncertain time. And these companies have navigated these choppy waters better than others.
Your Excellency, any thoughts about what Paul just said?
I can only agree more. We were talking also sometimes about women empowerment as well, and I think this is a big connection to what Paul said. I think empathy and caring are some of the very strong values that's needed now, and that, again, for any partnership to work, it comes down to trust at the end of the day, and building that trust it happens much quicker when the other side or the potential partner can feel, I can trust this person, or I feel comfortable with this relationship and this partnership. If someone is a bit more arrogant or thinks very selfishly, then it won't happen. And so I think this tends now to going towards to the also women empowerment as well. And this is, again, something we're very lucky with here in the UAE, that our leadership really do everything they can to empower us as women. A third of our cabinet are women, 50% of the parliament are women. And you really see this cascading down to so many sectors, that these partnerships then become also a lot easier. Nothing against the men here, because we need the men just as much as we do need the women. But of course, there are many, in many countries, unfortunately, the women are not facing the same privileges that we are facing here as well.
So, Paul, you mentioned technology, and Your Excellency, you mentioned CSR. There was a time when technology was a sort of a separate piece of corporate organization and corporate strategy making, and now it's in the warp and weft of all business strategy. Paul, do you see a time when sustainability becomes an integral part of strategy making for business?
Well, it has to be. I think it cannot be a sideshow. What we've now seen is that in anything we do, we need to take the multiple stakeholders, which includes the planet and the future generations, into account. If you don't integrate sustainability at the heart of your strategy, I think it's very difficult to really develop the right strategy to be competitive over time. And technology obviously is a big part of that, reinventing business models. You take the economies in the Middle East, and obviously the UAE has taken a leadership there. But this is an economy that is realistically is totally dependent on fossil fuel, and that's not their fault. We've all benefited from the enormous economic growth that has enabled us. But now they need to shift their economies enormously to create resilience, to create jobs, and to have a future that obviously is sustainable. That's a region that probably suffers more from climate change than anywhere else. And it's technology that enables that. The plans of the region to go to hydrogen, to bring agriculture there and really have the future of agriculture, regenerative agriculture. You can really, often building it from scratch is an advantage. So technology is a big part, and sustainability has to be ingrained in all parts of decision making. Just like we need to have inclusion in all parts of decision making. When Unilever, which has over 50% women on the boards and 50% women in management, but that was, to me, not really the most important thing. For me, the most important thing was equality in the value chain, including people with disabilities, the gender, but extending that. And the same should be true in the way we think about all the other elements of sustainability. It doesn't serve to say, I have no carbon emission in my office and flying, when you produce products that are probably associated with the biggest carbon emissions in the world. So implementing that in all parts of a business are the businesses that are going to be successful and you want to invest in.
Your Excellency, how does the government encourage business to bring Paul's vision to life with sustainability and equality and equity woven into strategy and decision making?
First of all, any strategy that the UAE government launches has sustainability at its heart, because it's part of the way because the Prime Minister's office gives us certain guidelines whenever we're sort of developing a strategy. In these guidelines, there are things like ensuring, for example, the youth need to also look over this. They have a say in this. We have a Minister of Youth Affairs who ensures that any policies, any strategies that the youth have, also their feedback on it, and they have a say on it. And the same goes for sustainability. We are, as a country, also committed to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So these goals they form part of whenever we develop a new strategy. Like, I was heavily involved when we developed the National Food Security Strategy, which we launched in 2018. We started with the SDGs. This is where we then built around the SDGs and developed the strategy and made sure we encompassed all the areas of food security into it. So this is the way we do work in the government. So sustainability is at heart. And I also, because of that, it sort of cascades down also to the private sector. And the private sector, each one with their own strategies of moving forward. They're always thinking of profitability. But it's as Paul said, it's now not just the economic opportunities, but also the market force that plays a role. And sustainability is now becoming even more important in everything that we do. Just going through, I often think, as an individual as well, I think it's also really important that we reflect on how we live our lives as well. That also plays such a role. I mean, I was so heavily involved with the food systems that I have really changed the way I've eaten, the way I eat now. I mean, you can ask my colleagues here. It's a huge change to when I started and where I am now, and that's because of the knowledge I have gained and understanding that some of the things I was doing, it was me as an individual pushing the food systems in a direction that was very unsustainable. When you just think of food loss or food waste at home, I mean, it really is such a huge effect when you think of just reflecting on what we each in our households do as well. So it's not just governments and private sector, but it also comes down to each of us as individuals as well. How are we, I mean, we're talking and okay, we maybe do it in our profession, but are we doing it really at home because we feel we really need to do this, because we care about this? I think that's really important for many of, when I speak to the youth especially, I tell them, you guys are the advocates, the ambassadors of the next generation, and unfortunately they are going to be facing much more climate extremes, which we're seeing in the past few years, the floods, the fires. They're going to be seeing more of that, and it's really important that they understand that the way they live their lives also plays a huge role on this. And I mean, as Paul is so right when we think of our cars now. I mean, if I think back when I was 18 and thinking about the first car that I would buy, at that time there were no electric cars. But now, for sure, when you think of the next car, you think of, okay, how is it ranked on emissions, and of course it has to be affordable as well. That's also an important aspect. Everything that we're doing on the food systems, on energy, we always have to think of, is it also affordable for all? Because many people maybe don't have the means to actually take a product that is has less carbon emissions, or a service that provides less carbon emissions. So that aspect is also really important. Yeah, so this sustainability in the heart of everything we do is the way the government works here. And something that I also feel we all as individuals need to take that responsibility as well.
Paul, I wonder how we encourage corporate leaders to follow the kind of example that Her Excellency just described. How do we make that happen?
Well, the corporate world measures what it treasures. And I think the biggest incentive will come from forcing disclosure where it counts, forcing the boards and management to look at different measures than just financial return. What we've seen is that countries, for example, that have enshrined the recommendations of the Task Force of Financial Disclosure for Climate-Related Risks into their legislation, or countries that have installed a price on carbon, that they tend to see an acceleration in the private sector as well, but also actually are more competitive now. It can clearly be linked with results. So broadening the requirements to some extent together on what is acceptable is the first thing. The Sustainable Standard Board, once more, that has been launched at the COP26 is an important element in that direction. The European Green Deal, the SEC now looking at it, the taxonomy. Increasingly, governments are looking at internalizing again into the businesses these negative externalities. That's the first thing that needs to be done. And then the second one is really the broader partnerships. Business really is willing to join, I think, the responsible part of business. But as Her Excellency says, we need to really forge these broader partnerships to actually take away some of the fear, some of the risks of competitive disadvantage, some of the costs that are involved, and how can we get the right incentive systems from governments that help the private sector move at an accelerated pace.
Your Excellency, thoughts on what Paul just said?
Yeah, I think what's really important here as well is incentive systems, I think, is very important. We need to now, let's say, reward those that are doing good, and instead of saying, okay, if you don't do this, you're going to get a penalty for it. So we're kind of nudging more into good behavior are rewarded. And this is, I feel now, the movement that we have to do. Why should a company put other taps in their sinks and think of lights that switch off when there's no movement? And why should they, initially they have to invest a little bit. So why should they move into that if there's no reward for it? So it's really important that we also as governments encourage these reward schemes. And we're doing it as well on a government level to ensure, I mean, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment is a platinum LEED certified building. And, you know, we put that investment down because for us it was really important. We're representing the environment and climate change with sustainability at our hearts, so it's really important that we walk the talk, basically. And so the employees that come every day into the offices, they see how the lights switch on automatically when there's movement. They see that the water pressure is somewhat not so strong, so that there's not so much water consumption. So there are these elements and behavior change nudges that we need to do to encourage sort of the community and also the working space to move in that direction. So incentive schemes are really important here, and you kind of have to find something that's a little bit out of the box now, not just points or things like that. So we're always trying to think of new ideas on how to make those incentive schemes, because not every CEO is like Paul that has the heart to say, I want to push this, I want to drive this. You know, even living here in the UAE, we are a very, we've got over 200 nationalities here. living here together. And so, and this is wonderful for us because it's just wonderful to be around so many beautiful people from different places. But again, everybody comes with from different places where they've learned to live a certain way. And so getting everyone here and sort of living the same way and understanding how important it is to conserve water, how important it is to try and maybe use public transportation, because the UAE was very much, so it didn't have so much public transportation in the past, but now we have the metro, we've got the Etihad rail coming up soon. So there's so many things happening where we're going to live a little bit differently than what we've been used to in the past years. And so it's really important to have these, let's say, or also people who have huge followers, I would say, and seeing how they live, and then you have the younger generation and the others sort of following. Oh, this person is now driving an electric car. I'm also going to drive an electric car. This is very much when you look at the social media and you look at how the community here in the UAE work, they very much look up to certain people to see how they behave, what they do, what restaurants do they go to, how do they eat. And you kind of use this as well as a leverage to push and nudge for good behavior.
So, Your Excellency, I wonder, are you actually working within the influencer ecosystem? Are you able to tap into that?
So I have my own social media accounts, but yeah, no, it's of course I mean, I also follow certain people. I have a few mentors that I look up to, but yeah, I do always make sure that whatever I post, it kind of also shows good behavior and sort of. But I also like to educate as well, because not everything is so clear for people as to why you're doing certain things. I mean, we are in this subject. We're talking. I mean, every day I'm reading reports on climate change, I'm seeing the numbers, but if you think of most of the people, they don't get those insights. So it's really important just to make them understand what is actually climate change. A lot of people don't actually understand the meaning of it. And so as we now take our journey, and I want to make sure people understand everything we do is not just because of COP28. Like COP28 is a very important milestone, it's an event, but we want to leverage what we're doing now and COP28 into what opportunities the UAE can really become. Imagine the UAE really becoming a hub for a climate change bank, for example, that will be helping developing countries, or the opportunities that we're seeing on the technology that we are now using to grow food in a climate that we never thought we could grow these kind of foods in, and being a hub, and that knowledge being then given to other countries as well. And of course, with anything new, it's now at a very high cost. Same as Paul mentioned, you've got the solar energy that was at 5 cents, and now it's at 1.35 cents. So it's a journey we have to take. And we're very blessed here. First of all, we have the political will, we have the resources, and we really want to invest in that to try and bring down those costs so that we can work hand in hand with the developing countries to help them as well, because at the end of the day we've got one earth and we need to take care of it together, so everyone has to do their part.
At this point, I'd love to open up the conversation, bring in Josh Macht, whom you heard from before, and also Vinay Hebar, Harvard Business Publishing Senior Vice President and Head of International Markets. And I'd also love to open up the conversation to our attendees in the room and to our virtual attendees. We have a microphone. We can take your questions or your thoughts. If you're with us virtually, please enter your questions and thoughts in the chat, and we'd love to bring you in. Let me get this part of the conversation started with something you were talking about a little earlier, Your Excellency. You're clearly very passionate about how leaders lead, that we need a kind of a new model of leadership. Can you talk a little bit more about that new model, what it looks like, how it differs from the traditional models?
First of all, we need a leader that's close to the people. I'll give you an example. When COVID hit, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed spoke to the people and told them, don't worry, la tshilunhem. This means don't worry. He said, medicine and food will always be available for you. And just these 3 words that he said was such a huge confidence booster for the people, because the first few weeks, I mean, you can imagine on social media in so many different countries, there were shelves where certain foods were not available anymore, toilet paper, lots of different things. And so naturally, people started thinking, oh, should I also buy a few things more, and should I stock a little bit? I mean, who knows where this is going to go? But just his words really helped the country just calm down. We also, all the, I mean, those of you living here in the UAE, I'm sure you saw the news. You always saw updates that were coming from the concerned authorities to say, okay, we've set up now 10 PCR tests, and this is what we're going to do. Things were always very clear. It wasn't, I mean, again, this is also, we're very blessed here in that when the leadership does something and does something very clearly, we have full trust and we go that direction. And I think it's because of that we've also managed to host Expo in this pandemic. I think this is a huge, it's been so far a huge success, Expo in itself, having over I think it's 192 pavilions at Expo, and I mean, I've been there a few times myself, and it's just amazing that it has happened and that people can access it. And I'm sure a lot of you that are sitting here in this room have also had the privilege of going there, and just being able to see such an exposition happen during one of the toughest times or years that we've had has just been amazing. And I think it is because of the steps that our leadership have taken. You'll see now some posts I see of His Highness Sheikh Zayed, our founding father, God bless and rest his soul. And he's, just so the Expo, the being close to the people, and it's again it comes to credibility as well. When our leadership says something, they mean it and they do it. And I think this is a huge trust bridge that we've seen as well. So for me, leadership, it's being close to the people, being able to trust this person, what this person says gets done. Someone who you can have access to. I mean, we're very, very blessed as well here in the UAE that we have access to our leadership. They're not in a closed room or a closed palace and we don't see them. So they have their majlis, which is like an open sitting room, and you're able to join this kind of sitting room area. You can go towards them, you can speak to them. So this openness and transparency is really important as well. And empathy. I cannot, again, being very lucky that our leadership are really, they're listeners. They listen, they care, and it's an honor for me to be part of the government in the UAE because of the leadership that we have. So these are just some of the traits that I see that are important.
So openness, transparency, caring, those are the leadership qualities that we need right now. Josh, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, let me add another attribute, because I hear a lot of it when Her Excellency speaks, and I'm thrilled to hear it, which is authenticity. So, I mean, it's in very clear the leadership ideals of having a clear vision and purpose come beaming through as Her Excellency speaks. But this authenticity really strikes me because, and it's coupled for me with humility, that I think more and more what we talk about in our pages and online and what we publish at Harvard, I think is around, that when Her Excellency talks about what he can do at home and yourself, and you get a real sense of you. And I'm a million miles away and dealing through this connection, and I sort of feel this, and I'm sure others do too. Wow, this person's really committed. This is a genuine person who has a sense of, you know, history and a sense of purpose, but then it's brought to, you know, your legitimate sort of yourself. And it goes with credibility in two ways that I think about, because we've talked a lot about credibility, but one of the hardest things is the long-term vision. And you said something early on that's always struck me about UAE, where, you know, economic diversification, it always felt like you were so far ahead of the curve on that. And you referenced it earlier, going back years, over a decade now. So that is a lot of credibility right there in and of itself, where, you know, to be able to say we have a history of doing this, we've been doing this for a long time. And when we look to the long term now, because one of the things I think is hard is, how are we investing in the long term? What are those investments that the UAE needs to put into sustainability, to the future businesses? And the last thing I'll say is, you know, I'm always struck when I read the history of just how the in the United States, how the investment in the internet paid off very early on to many things we never saw and never even imagined on the business side. Sometimes business just takes total credit for it, as if the government didn't even exist. But really, this is the investment from government is so critical from a long range point of view. And I think that adds to the credibility that you've done that. Curious how that's going to be unfolding going forward.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to also mention, thank you so much for your words. You know, I mean, I've said a lot of examples of where I feel this is where the UAE is really good at, but I think it's also important to say that we're not perfect. We also have challenges. For example, if I look at the food loss, food waste, let's say file, that's a place where we need to double up our efforts and put more effort in. So we're really good at some things, but there are also areas that really need focus and improvement. And I look at those things, and again, it's the stakeholders with whom we have to deal with. Maybe certain infrastructure is not there in certain Emirates. So because it's a whole, you have to take that as a holistic a chapter in itself. So in a way, I just want to tell you also that even if we also are not embarrassed to say what challenges we have. I think that's really important to say, yes, we're good at certain things, but there are also some things where we know we need to work with partners on how we can sort of bring this forward as well. So I think just to add to what you were saying, as just to say that it's also really important for countries and for partners to show, okay, here we're good, we're strong at, but we're weak on this point, and we'd like to work with you to strengthen on this point as well.
So it sounds like you're adding a couple of attributes. It's candor and a willingness to learn and grow. Vinay, your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Amy. Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I think I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Her Highness and Josh have been talking about, which is really table stakes skills for leaders in managing self, or as Paul quoted from Rumi, changing self, right? I think without that, it's hard to be a leader who has a true desire to be a force for good, whether as an individual or their company. But as I reflect on the work we do with corporates globally around the theme of ESG leadership, there are 3 or 4 other capabilities that come to the fore, right? And just want to acknowledge for a minute that unlike traditional CSR or philanthropy, ESG leadership as we know it today is a relatively young concept and a developing set of muscles for most leaders globally. I mean, it was only, 6 or 7 years ago when Michael Porter made what was then a bold statement that shared value would reinvent capitalism. And the central idea there was that the purpose of a company is to achieve both shareholder profit and social purpose. So at that point of time, that was new, but we've come a long way to a net positive worldview. And I think 3 or 4 other capabilities I'll quickly touch on. One is leading in a rapidly evolving environmental, social, and political ecosystem. And this includes skills like design thinking, developing strategy, system thinking, having a global perspective, right? The second is putting purpose at the core and influencing other stakeholders. So, the ESG vision, strategy, framework, and being able to translate this into goals for the entire organization. The third is collaborate with stakeholders. We talked about multilateralism, where we need to integrate within the company the ESG priorities with the business, and then also external stakeholders, often your partners, supply chain, or maybe other companies globally. And lastly, it's the driving organizational accountability, which includes elements of trust, transparency, accountability, which Her Highness and Paul also emphasized. It's the need to build this amongst both internal and external stakeholders by measuring impact and identifying gaps. Paul said corporates measure what they treasure. I may add a corollary here, which is they support what they have to report. So having the vulnerability to report the gaps and then bridge them, I think, is the other area which leaders need to work on.
So I wonder if there are any questions in the room or any thoughts, Saleh or
Okay, thank you, Ami. Before we start the question, I have to give you this story. In the initial stage, usually I was thinking that we're not doing enough when it comes for communications regarding the sustainability and environment issues. Usually I don't take my lunch at home because, our timing and our hours. So today I decided that before the sessions, I will go take my lunch with the families and then I will be coming for the sessions. So when I sat at the lunch, one of my daughter came to me. She said, Baba, I want to read to you my essay at school. I said, okay, go ahead, start your essay. Guess what was the topic?
Food? Something with food?
I was really surprised. Climate change. So she was reading to me climate change when I was having the session today. So it really changed my mind in terms of communication. I think we're doing communication. So if they start with the kids at the school, that this topic is already being taught to them to go through research, investigate, that this means that I really thank our government, who we are really blessed with, who's really seeing things, sometimes we don't really notice it, but the work is already being done in the different level. And I would like really to thank you. Thank the government really to taking the lead and show us all these great efforts that they're putting. I promised my daughter that I will be telling the story.
Yeah, good. Tell her we send her our regards.
I will.
Thank you for story, and it makes me think how much as we are trying to engage just a whole new generation of people who want to come to work for Harvard Business Publishing, Harvard Business Review. It's so interesting because there's such a deep interest and engagement around these issues. And there's so much more transparency around knowledge that's available, right? And I think this is a great thing, but it really forces us as leaders to think. I think about our own business model as we've become, and something that I've been a big part of spearheading for years. The publishing company is moving increasingly digital. And you think about reducing your carbon footprint, or, we've actually reduced print, but that's not necessarily, there's still such an issue around when you go digital. And what you find is that younger people are saying, but what about the whole value chain? What's happening with the servers? What's happening with all the water that these companies are using? What are our partners doing? I mean, Her Excellency, when you talked about buying a car when you were 18, I was thinking the same thing. I wasn't thinking about any of this. I don't know about, when I was 18. Now when I just bought my first electric vehicle and I thought, wait a second, but how am I using electricity now? How do I reduce that carbon? Where's the source of this? And these are becoming much more, these are things that everyone more and more now, it goes to equitable access to education, because I think we all need that in order to be living in a just world, because everyone needs access to that sort of information, but more and more people do have access, and they are asking these second, third order questions around personal choices. And that definitely goes to, where do I go to work every day? Am I proud of this organization and the partners that we have? So the sharing of that story it's really a beautiful thing. I appreciate it. So thank you.
And George, just to add to that, when you were reflecting on our company, it reminded me of another change that I'm seeing, which is previously ESG, sustainability, etc., were focused on large companies, big, large public companies. But today, even small companies, privately owned companies, are feeling the pressure of any opportunity from employees and customers to make that change. So, which is why it's front and center for leaders. It doesn't matter what your domain is and which region you are, which industry you are, and the size of your company.
So let's open this up to our attendees. Saleh, are there any questions or thoughts in the room?
Yes, I think Tariq has a question. Go ahead, Tariq.
Yes, I do. Your Excellency, absolute privilege and honor to listen to you, and also to Paul earlier on. My name is Tariq Qureshi. Amongst other things, I'm also a futurist. And I see climate change and the environment as the single largest challenge of the entire century, and the single largest opportunity of the entire century. And therefore, if we can just find a way to reframe in our minds that this is the single largest opportunity, there will be carbon taxes, there will be many, many things. Trillions and trillions of dollars will be released over the next 10 to 20 years. So it becomes a huge opportunity. So smart people will invest in it today. The second key point that I wanted to talk about was about storytelling. Most of us have watched Don't Look Up. I watched it 3 times. And every time I watched it, I discovered new things. Now, we can have events like this and conferences and so on, but we'll reach 1,000 people, we'll reach 10,000 people. A movie like that has reached tens and tens of millions of people. It has made greater impact in terms of understanding climate change. It has made greater impact in terms of understanding apathy and the connectivity of the flow of things that are going on. So I think you mentioned communication, Your Excellency. I would go one stage further. Let's talk about storytelling. Mm-hmm. And that storytelling can then extend, and we're doing a lot of work in the COP28 side in terms of developing concepts and so on, which I'll be reaching to you and His Excellency Dr. Sultan. And that is about creating an immersive experience that it inspire us for a long time. It's not an event. Like you said, it's a milestone, but it builds something. So my question, sorry about the monologue, but my question to you is that within COP28, we do amazing events in the UAE, but what are the sustainable milestones that we can work with and support you and build with you? Because it is such a huge opportunity to do something meaningful. And that really is my key question to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It's early days to say what exactly the milestones are, but I'll just give you some insight. So right now we're discussing what the governance model will look like for, let's say, the COP28 unit, because we will need a dedicated team to take this forward. Plus, we also don't want to overshadow, COP27 is coming as well, so we want to work together with our friends in Egypt to make that a success and then build upon what was at COP26 onwards. And my thinking at the moment is now everyone uses Paris Agreement for everything. And I hope that at COP28 we can have an Abu Dhabi something, right? So that many people will just continue talking about over the years. So that's one vision I have. Also, that we can really make it a solution-based COP with solutions that are scalable. I think that's really important. I want to make sure, because I felt at COP26 the developing countries were very disappointed because all the finance promises that were made have not yet been achieved. They don't have access to this finance yet. And so I hope that by COP28 that the developing countries will feel, right, we now have access to this, to finance, we have access to scale up, we can now start really getting onto the implementation. So those are a bit of the insights that I can give right now. But we will be working together with people like yourselves. I was going to say, how can we serve? That's what's the key point. Absolutely, and I am totally with you on the storytelling. This is how we'll reach people. This is how we'll reach all, like we talked about the word inclusivity, all parts of the community. It's so important that, I mean, when you look at what happened in COP26, I think they said it was 50,000 were registered, and I think about 30,000 were actually there physically. It was a huge event, but we hope it's going to be even bigger because we actually have the infrastructure for it. And it is such a great time after what we've been through now with Expo and what we've learned through Expo. We are able to hold these kind of events. But for the leadership, it's even more important that people will leave with something, so with a great experience, first of all, and with content that they feel, okay, now we feel we've taken, in a way, the curve is going in a certain direction, but we have a bend now in the curve. This is what we hope. We know that it'll be the first global stock take in that year as well, so this is also a big milestone that will be measuring where we are compared to all the NDCs that the countries have put forward. And we are also working now, and we want to put down the next NDCs this year, because we want to also, we feel we have so much to update, and we feel we need to put more, let's say, stricter targets as well for ourselves. So these are some
and I hope we will not. I'm sure we won't be served in single-use plastic plates and cups made in China, which is what happened at COP26.
Yes. By the way, food was a big thing at COP26. I mean, that was something where I thought, okay, definitely at COP28 we will focus on what food is being served and putting a bit more time and effort on that aspect. Again, COP26 it was a COP in a very difficult time as well, so it's, but we hope that what's happening now, we hope that we're at the end of the wave in all the countries, and that by the time COP28 comes, that we're able to look at things like single use, what you said, we need to look at all the materials that are being used at the venue itself, so that people feel the event itself is also about sustainability and climate action. Thank you.
Saleh, any other questions in the room? We're closing in on 1:30, so I just want to be mindful of people's time.
I think if we don't have any question here, we can go to virtual.
Yes, well, we have gotten quite a few questions. Let me bring in a question from Aruna Narayanan, who says, implementing the SDGs need investment and flow of finance toward projects that create real impact. What options are available for companies and startups in the UAE to access impact capital?
Okay, so let me first start with, we'll talk about food first, because different sectors, there's different funding mechanisms and different platforms that you can use. When we look at sustainable food systems for looking at startups, we launched the Food Tech Valley, so this is an address to go to. We also have the Abu Dhabi Investment Office, known as ADIO, They are financing a lot on novel products and emerging technologies and sort of rebating the research and development. We've got Hub 2071, we've got Area 2071, we have Sharjah Technology Park. So these are some of the few addresses that are just on top of my head of where startups can go here in the UAE.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. This has been so enlightening and, just truly informative. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our attendees, both in person and virtual. We'd love to get your help in improving these think tank events. And we're going to drop a link into the chat for a very brief survey to get your views on what we're doing here. For now, I want to thank everyone for joining us and for your time, and especially you, Your Excellency. And I will wrap it up right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.